Hi everyone, an introduction to ethics. What I'd like to do is talk to you about the readings that you have for this week from Michael Sandel's Justice. Recall that I've assigned to you several different readings from the book for this week. In this video, I'm going to focus on pages 58 to 70, which is chapter 3, which is titled "Do We Own Ourselves? Libertarianism." Um, But before I go too far into libertarianism, let me just say a little bit about kind of what's motivating um, us to kind of move in this direction now. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we did in the first part of the course and what we're doing in this part of the course. So, um, in the first part of the course, we looked at three different normative ethical theories. We thought about how to apply them to various scenarios. We looked at the specific vocabulary associated with Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, and we tried to understand what are their arguments for how they set up their normative standards. And within each of those normative standards, there is a kind of core to them. There's a kind of what I want to call a normative core, which is to say where it is that the standard or the normativity is located. And for each of the theories, well, for Aristotle, that's located in virtue. It's located in virtuous human behavior. It's located in these, character traits that we find desirable in other human beings and in ourselves, and we want to promote those through our reasoning about our actions and about our choices. For Kant, it had to do with reasoning as well. It had to do with our ability to reason and give ourselves rules that we should follow, but that we would also expect everyone else to follow. And he called those rules that we give ourselves imperatives or commands. But at the core of Kantian ethics is a focus on autonomy, on freedom. It's not that someone else is imposing those rules on me, it's that I am imposing them on myself. And so for Kant, it's this ability to give myself rules, to decide for myself um, how I will act according to the structure of rules that I will give myself. That is freedom for Kant. It's not doing whatever you want, but there is a significant focus on autonomy for Kant, which is giving myself rules that I would follow and that I would expect others to follow. So we've got virtue in Aristotle, we've got autonomy in Kant, and then for John Stuart Mill, it's a focus on obviously on utility or on promoting the general welfare. And so we've got these three basic cores of these ethical theories. And what I'm trying to think about, sort of in the second part of the course, is how these basic core ideas of the three different ethical theories, how do they show up when we think about um, what kinds of laws and what kinds of policies we find good or bad at the governmental level. In other words, at the political level. So, in other words, in short, what I'm trying to do is to show the connection between political philosophy, and libertarian is an example of a political philosophy. I'm trying to show the connection between politics and morality, in other words. I'm trying to show how it is that morality shows up in our debates about certain laws and certain policies that we would want to make. And I gave an example of this, or there's a really good example of this given at the beginning of the book with the price gouging laws. In essence, what I'm suggesting, and I think what even Sandel is suggesting, is that our debates about policies and laws are political debates. Yes, they are political debates, but they are presupposing a moral debate. And I'm just trying to see, how do those different moral, those different cores, virtue, autonomy, and utility or welfare, how do they show up when we're reasoning or having arguments about what we think good laws and good policies are? And so that's kind of the transition from the first part of the course to the second part of the course. And so this first chapter looks at a political philosophy or a political ideology. Um, and a political philosophy, more or less what a political philosophy does, is it proposes a theory for what the role of government should be. In other words, it tries to answer the question, why does government exist? What um, what purpose does it serve? And it also tries to figure out what the proper relationship should be between the government and the citizens. So political philosophy is interested in that. But again, political philosophy presupposes some of these ideas about morality. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that within libertarian political philosophy, within this chapter, it in a sense it presupposes, it places a premium on autonomy, which is a Kantian idea. And libertarianism takes as its founding premise the idea that human beings own themselves, that we own our bodies, we own the actions that we engage in with our bodies, um, and we and anything that is produced as a result of actions that we engage in, that also then belongs to us. Because we own ourselves, whatever we accomplish with ourselves, with our activity, that also becomes mine as well. And so, in particular, this is in the context of chapter 3, we're thinking a lot about how far do we want to push this idea that we own ourselves? How far do we want to go with that? Libertarianism seems to want to go pretty far. That essentially, because we own ourselves, we we pretty much have a wide range of autonomy in terms of what we can do. And there has to be a pretty heavy burden placed upon any entity that wants to try and interfere with my autonomy or with any of the things that I produce or any of the things that I come to own as a result of my autonomy. And so there has to be a pretty heavy burden, in particular upon another person to interfere with my autonomy or with the government. So if we're talking about morality, it would be, how can we justify another person interfering with my autonomy? And if we're talking about um, political philosophy, what justification can there be for the government to interfere with my autonomy, with my self ownership? And so that's the premise of libertarianism. And so again, as a political philosophy, this is what libertarianism recommends: a very, very minimal role for the government, an extremely minimal role for the government to play in the lives of its citizens. And that because of the fact of self-ownership, because we own ourselves, that that again, that is the ideal. That what libertarianism recommends is a large amount of personal liberty and personal freedom for its citizens, and minimal government interference in the lives of its citizens. And so one of the big examples that comes up at the beginning of this chapter is about um, taxation. And this is one of the, kind of classic issues with which libertarians disagree is that they do not favor a tax system where people that make more money are taxed at a higher rate so that that money can then be redistributed to people that make less money. Libertarians, because of the fact of self ownership, because I own myself and because I own any activity that I engage in and anything that I come to acquire, that includes the money that I make and the money that I earn. That belongs to me. So when the government taxes me, it's claiming ownership of me in a sense. And for a libertarian, that is the gravest kind of concern from a moral perspective, is that nobody can claim ownership of me except me. But when the government taxes me, it's claiming a stake in me in a sense. And so that is sort of the libertarian impulse, is to say taxation for the purposes of redistribution is not fair. And so on page so if you look at page so in the context of this example about Michael Jordan, and I'm not going to go through that example in great detail, but I think you can kind of get what's going on there. So Sandel's referencing a guy by the name of Robert Nozick, who's a very well-known 20th century political philosopher, and he was a strong advocate of libertarian thinking. And so he's referencing Nozick here on page 65. He writes, "What exactly is wrong with taxing Jordan's earnings? According to Nozick, the moral stakes go beyond money. At issue, he believes, is nothing less than human freedom." So there's the stuff about autonomy. He reasons as follows, quote, "Taxation of earnings from labor is on par with forced labor. If the state has the right to claim some portion of my earnings, it also has the right to claim some portion of my time. Instead of taking, say, 30% of my income, it might as well direct me to spend 30% of my time working for the state. But if the state can force me to labor in its behalf, it essentially asserts a property right in me." So that's a very far-reaching claim about libertarianism and about a view of taxation, that the government, if it taxes me, it also taxes my labor, and when I labor, then it might as well own my time. It can tell me how to spend my time and what to do with my time. So why not just bring me to work for the government? It's a you may think that logically maybe that follows, but um, I'm not sure how many of you are on board with Nozick's thinking there to the extent that he goes. That may be an extreme sort of form of libertarianism. Maybe you haven't thought about that before. But in a sense, Nozick thinks, a libertarian thinks, that if self-ownership, if autonomy, if personal liberty is the foundation of what it means to be a human being, then we have to take that seriously all the time. We can't be willing to kind of make some, to carve out some exceptions here and there. He thinks that libertarianism, because it values personal liberty and autonomy to such an extent, that it is one of the most consistent ways of thinking about politics that we have. It doesn't say sometimes it's okay for the government to intervene and other times it's not. So, for example, libertarians would also oppose things like states saying that a man and a woman can't, states making laws against gay marriage. Libertarians would also oppose that. So libertarians find themselves sort of in between traditional liberal ideas and traditional conservative ideas, but they, in some ways, find themselves to be the most consistent because they don't try to make exceptions. They just say, if personal freedom and personal autonomy is the core of what it means to be a human being, then we shouldn't make sacrifices and exceptions for that based upon some other factor. So that's libertarianism. That's the example of taxation. Now, all I want to do, I just kind of want to go through. So Sandel considers a number of objections to this, right? Sandel considers a number of objections, and I want to kind of think of. I'm not going to go through each of these, but on 66 to 69, Sandel considers several objections to the libertarian claim, right? And so he goes through a number of these. Taxation is not as bad as forced labor, so that could be one thing. You might disagree with Nozick's premise that taxing me is somehow the same as claiming that you own me and you can make me come work for the government. You might just find that not to be a convincing premise. There's also the poor that need the money more. But the last one is the one I want to sort of think about, and this is where Sandel, I think, is coming from. Sandel's coming from the idea, what about, do we really own ourselves and everything that we do? Do we own ourselves? Is self-ownership a convincing starting point for thinking about what it means to be a human being? Sandel is not convinced that we own ourselves to the extent that libertarians would suggest. Sandel you know, he thinks about the idea that in fact maybe some of Michael Jordan's talents and his abilities don't actually belong to him, but that he was born with a good set of genes. He got lucky, in other words. It's not that Jordan didn't have to work hard to perfect those talents, but the talents themselves don't belong to him in the first place. That they were a genetic accident, a genetic gift that he has, and that other people don't have, but other people have different genetic gifts. And so anyways, that's just one way of thinking about it, that maybe Michael Jordan doesn't own his talents. And if he doesn't own his talents to the extent that libertarianism suggests, then maybe claims about taxation are not as problematic as they would seem from the libertarian perspective. That's kind of all I want to say. Now, I just want to, again, Sandel in this chapter, he's simply trying to get you to think, how far do you want to go with this idea of self-ownership? So he goes through examples of selling kidneys. Then he gives an example of assisted suicide. Then he gives an extreme example at the end of the chapter about what he calls consensual cannibalism. And this is a true story, that this really pushes the idea of self-ownership about as far as it can go. And the example is simply that somebody is looking for someone who would be willing to be killed and be eaten. And what at the end of the chapter here, Sandel writes, and this is on page 74, cannibalism between consenting adults poses the ultimate cannibalism between consenting adults poses the ultimate test for the libertarian principle of self-ownership and the idea of justice that follows from it. So that seems to be, again, if the libertarian is convinced of self-ownership, then would the libertarian be willing to go as far as saying, yes, if somebody answers an ad in the paper, shows up to the front door and says, yes, I consent for you to kill me and I consent for you to eat me. Look, it's a voluntary exchange. If autonomy is what we're concerned with, no one has coerced him into doing it. He just answered an ad in the newspaper. So if the libertarian is consistent, maybe the libertarian should find nothing wrong with this practice. And so that's about kind of it. I'm coming up on here on about 20 minutes. And so I just wanted to kind of introduce you to what libertarianism is and to think about how it is that the Kantian idea of autonomy shows up as kind of the core of libertarianism. And when we're debating about certain laws and policies, is autonomy, should that be our primary consideration? As we think about what are the best laws that we should make as a society, what kinds of government policies should we make? Should autonomy or freedom always be the primary consideration? For a libertarian, the answer is yes. The question is, are there other competing considerations like welfare, for example, or virtue? Are those other competing considerations? Do they do they sometimes override concerns of autonomy, and when? And we're going to be thinking about that in other examples as we go through it. So, in other words, again, real quick, we're not leaving the normative theories behind. We're just thinking now, as we think about laws and policies, which of the three normative ethical theories and the core idea and the three ideas at the core of each of them, which of those do we think is more important when considerations of law and policy are being debated? Do we find autonomy most important? Do we find utility most important? Or do we find virtue most important? And that's what we're going to be thinking about.